This episode is with Martin Nesvig, a history professor at the University of Miami, whose interests primarily encompass the effects of the Spanish conquest of Mexico. Thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy this episode. I looked a little bit into some of the work you've done. I saw you've written a couple books,
right?
And mostly focused on, I believe it's like the religious implications of the Spanish coming into Mexico.
Yep.
Okay, so why don't you explain a little bit about your background, who you are, and we can start there.
Yeah, sure. I don't know how far back you want me to go. I'm from.
It doesn't really matter.
Yeah. I mean, I was born and raised in San Diego, and I lived the first 30 years of my life in California, and then I left California to go to graduate school, and then when I was in graduate school, I lived in Mexico City for a while, like probably about 3 years when I was in graduate school, and that was my first experience really living in Mexico. I had been there before, but I hadn't actually really lived there until I moved there in graduate school, and I lived in Mexico City and also lived in Morelia and Michoacan for a little while. And then, since then, I've been back and spent, lots of time in Mexico City ever since then. So that's kind of, where I've been geographically. And then I moved to Miami in 2005 when I started teaching at UM. And yeah, I've been in Miami ever since. I moved here in 2005. And so, yeah, my area of research, which is not necessarily the same as my teaching areas, because I teach a lot of different things, but my area of research is mostly has to do with sort of the kind of the cultural, religious implications of Spanish arrival in Mexico starting in the 15 teens. And so I'm kind of interested in that first century or so after the Spanish get to Mexico and kind of what happens as a result of their arrival, as well as the introduction of African slaves into Mexico starting really right away. 1519, there's African slaves in Mexico. In Cortez's expedition to Tenochtitlan, there was an African slave.
Right. So that's like your area of research, and what do you teach?
I teach a lot of different things. I teach Mexican history, which is kind of my main area of expertise. I teach Mexican history. I teach kind of general Latin American history on the colonial period. And then I teach a bunch of thematic things that are not necessarily my research areas, but that I have expertise in terms of teaching. So I teach a class on Hawaiian history and the history of surfing. I just got finished teaching that last semester, which is kind of a fun class to teach. I had taught for a few years, starting about 10 years ago, I created a class on the history of beaches, like kind of beach culture and politics and environment and ethnicity and all that sort of stuff. So kind of history of beaches. And, we always talked about Cancun and Acapulco and Miami and Rio and Brazil and Australia, and always Hawaii. And eventually about 3 years ago, I decided to just create a class on the history of Hawaii and the history of surfing. So I've been teaching that now for a couple of years, which is pretty fun. It's pretty interesting. I've learned a lot about Hawaiian history as I prepared to be able to teach that class. So I teach that. I teach queer history, which I'm teaching next semester, which is kind of like the history of queer men from like ancient times up to today. So I teach that. Originally, when I was in graduate school, I did a master's thesis on the history of homosexuality in Mexico, and that was going to be my kind of area of expertise. And then I ended up changing time period, because I was originally going to work on the 19th century, and then I changed and I ended up working on the 16th century. So that's like an area that I've had some interest in for a long time. And then I teach also a class periodically on the history of the Inquisition, which is like when I do my research, a lot of the evidence that I have comes from Inquisition trials in Mexico. So that's, yeah. And then I teach classes on the kind of like cultural contact and the conquest of Mexico, although nobody calls it the conquest anymore.
It's very diverse range.
Yeah. I mean, it keeps me busy. I guess I'm one of those people that I get bored if I'm just constantly doing the same thing all the time.
Yeah, I'm 100%. I completely agree with that. I think that a lot of times, and it's not just boredom, but a lot of times, if I tend to stick to a single thing, a single activity, or just if I don't break out of my schedule, once in a while and add new things to challenge me, like you said, you get bored, but also you don't really stimulate your mind and your whole being. Like, you have to try new things to keep improving and getting better at everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I could be a student again. I've taken some classes at over the years, and just out of personal interest, I took Italian classes for a couple of years, and then I kind of wish that I had time to take classes. I have this fantasy that I'm going to study Arabic, but who has time? I have my own job to do, and it's really hard to find time. But I envy students who just get to do nothing but study all the time.
I mean, one of the reasons I've made this podcast, or the main reason, is because I want to learn more about things I'm interested in. Because so my major is business technology. I don't really like it, but I'm about to graduate in it, so I'm just gonna finish it. I do have 3 minors, and my 3 minors are things I enjoy more, which is business law, because I was thinking of going to law school, and then I changed my mind on that. But business law, psychology, and motion pictures and movie making.
Cool.
Now, I always, since I was, I guess, a little kid, I liked history, and I liked learning about certain types of history, because a lot of times in school, and I think this is one of the things that isn't great about education, at least the way it was taught to me back when I was in Mexico, because that's where I had most of my school when I was growing up, is that you get taught things that you don't necessarily find interesting. So with history, for example, I really liked the whole like Roman and Greek and like the fights, the Spartans, and all those kinds of things that most kids and men, like growing up, little boys will like to learn about. Like, that's the kind of thing that I enjoyed learning more about. But then you'd get taught about how the first railroad was made, and although it's important to know about that, it's not as interesting. And then you just gotta you sometimes lose a little bit of interest in the things that you really do enjoy.
Totally.
And so I want to keep learning about those things that I do enjoy. And then, I mean, if some of the other ones also pop in there, that's fine too.
Yeah.
When did you, so you said you lived in Mexico. Is that where you kind of had an idea that you wanted to focus on this type of history?
Yeah, I mean, growing up in California, I was, kind of around sort of the idea of Mexico, but I grew up in a very white, suburban, kind of middle class part of Southern California. And it wasn't really until later that I started to really get to know Mexican people. And it was really originally when I worked in restaurants for a long time, and in California, as is the case in most of the country, most of the people who work in the kitchen are Latino and usually Mexican. And so that was kind of my first exposure to Mexican people. But that was way before I went to Mexico. And then, I mean, it was kind of by accident that I started studying Mexican history. It was just that I met some professors when I was an undergrad who were Mexican historians, and I found it really interesting. And then I started going to Mexico and spending time there. I spent a few summers there. Once I went to Michoacan, and then I went to Mexico City a couple summers in the late 90s. And then I just, fell in love with Mexico as a place, and just, really loved the people there and the culture. And so that was in the, the late 90s that I started um, having experiences in Mexico, spending my summers there. I spent like 3 summers in a row there before I actually moved there. And then I moved there in 2001 and lived there more or less the whole time for about 3 years in Mexico City. And I lived lots of different parts of the city. I lived in Condesa. I lived way far north, out by Bosques de San Juan de Aragon, in a kind of a sketchy neighborhood. And I lived way south. I spent some time in Coyoacan, and then I met my wife eventually. But we lived in a place called Fuentes Brotantes, which is way south, out by Tlalpan. So I've lived like all over the city. And I lived in Anzures, which is right by Chapultepec Park. So I've lived kind of lots of different parts of Mexico City. So I just, over the years, just spent more and more time there and just developed a love for Mexico. I've actually got my Sanborn's coffee cup here that we brought back, I think, one of our last trips there. It's a ceramic, but I don't think they would never serve coffee like in one of these in Sanborn's, but it's got the Sanborn's, design. So,
I don't remember the last time I went to a Sanborn's. I don't remember. I don't even know if they actually still. I'm sure there's still some, but I haven't seen one in a while.
They're everywhere. I mean, Sanborn's are everywhere. I mean, they're ubiquitous.
Yeah.
I mean, they're I don't know how many. There's hundreds of them. So I just really developed a love for Mexican culture and Mexican people. I just always felt like I got, it was like when I first started living in Mexico, I was like, oh, I feel kind of comfortable here. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it's the dark humor that Mexicans have,
I don't know.
Negro.
I seem to think that whenever I'm in Mexico and whenever I get to travel around Mexico and be there more than other places, I feel like people there are just more amicable and they're more friendly, and you just feel, like you said, more comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, como dice el dicho, Cortés como un mexicano. So
I haven't heard that one.
You never heard that one? Cortés
No.
como un mexicano, courteous like a Mexican. Mexican people are very, very polite, very friendly people, just in general. But I'm just curious, like, how did you find me? Like, what? I mean,
yeah. So, like I
what
said,
made you contact me? I'm just curious,
Right. So as I was looking into different fields of study that I want to learn more about, again, history is one of them. I was looking through the department in UM's, I guess, people, the faculty, and I was reading through the profiles, and I mean, I saw that you had some sort of specialization in Mexican history, and I was like, hey, you know what? I mean, this is perfect.
Totally. Yeah.
So I figured I'd reach out and see if you were interested, and I'm glad that you were.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, actually, of course, because this is what everybody does now. I Googled you, especially because you have like a unique name. Like if your name was like, Pedro Sanchez or Juan Diaz or something, it would have been like, forget it, never gonna. But like with your name, it's pretty unusual. So I discovered that you played football, and that you were the snapper for but also that you played club football in Mexico City, which I thought was really interesting because my father-in-law and my brother-in-law both played club American football in Mexico City for Los Gamos. I don't know if you know that team.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't think I ever played them, but I know that team.
Yeah. My father-in-law played for them. It must have been like in the 1950s, late 1950s. And then my brother-in-law played for them. It must have been, like the 1980s. And then one of my nephews, my brother-in-law's son, he played for a little while, but he wasn't into it, which is too bad because he's like super tall. I mean, I think he's like 6'4" now. And, he was tall when he was a kid, and he had these big, long legs and big, long arms. He had like the perfect wide receiver body. Just like my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law is tall and lanky. He's like 6'2", 6'3", and big, long arms. And he played wide receiver. because he had the perfect wide receiver body. And but anyway, I thought that was really interesting because it's a kind of a unique, kind of world of people who play club football, club American football in Mexico.
Yeah, it's bigger than I think. I think a lot of people think that it's a very small sport in Mexico, but it has its fan base. It has its like people that follows it. It's not as small. Of course, you have the big, the big sports. You have soccer. You have baseball is a lot bigger.
Right.
But it still has a good following.
Yeah, my wife's family. I mean, our family is super into American football. In fact, every year we have, we don't really bet any money, but everybody calls every single NFL game for the whole season, and then we add up, how many you predict. How many of your predictions come true, and then there's a winner. My mother-in-law always seems to win. She seems to be the one that is the best analyst. But like growing up, I mean, my wife I didn't meet until I was in my 30s, but when she was growing up, they would have everybody had to have a team. You had to have an NFL team that's your team, and then you had to know everybody on the team. So they would have pop quizzes at dinner. My father would be like, "All right, who's the quarterback for the Jets?" My father-in-law is a diehard Eagles fan, for the last 60, 70 years. Partly because his father had played American football and took him to Eagles games way back in the 1950s or something. And then my father-in-law's sister lived in Philadelphia for 40 years. So they used to go to Eagles games, and he's just a diehard Eagles fan.
Yeah. I was a Dolphins fan growing up. Funny enough, I ended up here.
That's too bad.
Yeah, I my cousin got me into it, and I started liking football when I was around 7, 8, and then I as I watched games, one of my goals was to play college football, and so I ended up going to boarding school for my last 2.5 years of high school near Tampa, and so I went school here to get recruited because it's really hard to get recruited from Mexico, and so then
super hard.
I managed to get recruited and come play at UM after high school in
cool
in a small city called Bradenton.
No.
Yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah, so that's kind of Florida, the way it went for me.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I played it back in Mexico. I played in I don't know if you know it, but it's called UVM. It's
right. Yeah, Universidad del Valle de Mexico.
Yeah, that's where I played.
Cool.
Yeah, and now that's going back to the whole history thing.
Totally.
Yeah. I've one quick thing before we go back to that, but I don't know if it happens to you, but after playing a sport or focusing on something for a very long time and almost becoming so involved with it that to the point where you're start to get a little bit tired of it, sometimes you just I don't know, I as I look back on it and I look back on football and everything, it's not as appealing to me as it used to be before. I think that's worth mentioning, which is unfortunate, but I think that happens.
Yeah. Well, that happens. People's interests change over years.
Yeah.
It's pretty normal.
Yeah. But anyway, what I was wondering, and when you told me that you focused on the Mexica culture, going back to the things that you would like to look into, what made you focus on that instead of say the Mayan culture or the Aztec culture or
so
any other
I mean
culture?
I guess I'm definitely not an expert on the Mexica, or the Mexica and the Aztecs are the same. They people used to call them the Aztecs. The Aztec is a word, people still use it in Mexico and they use it here. But it's a word that if you could transport yourself back in time to say 1518, the year before Cortez and the Europeans arrived in Tenochtitlan, if you said the Aztecs to them, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. They would be like, "What are you talking about, dude?" Because it's a word that they didn't use. They didn't it was a word that was invented by a Jesuit clavijero who was Mexican born. He was a Creole, which is to say he was ethnically Spanish, but he was born in Mexico. And he invented the word at the end of the 18th century. So the people that we call the Aztecs they call themselves Mexica or Tlatelolcos or Tenochcas or Azcapotzalcos. And I mean, they had a their sense of ethnicity and identity was very much tied to this thing called the Altepet, which is their kind of basic city-state unit. So like Tenochtitlan, which became Mexico City, Tenochtitlan was an Altepet. It comes from Atl, which means water, and Tepet, which means mountain. So it's the Altepet was their basic kind of socio-political unit. And then they were divided up into smaller units called Calpulis. But so they called themselves the name according to the Altepet that they inhabited, but they were also kind of known as the Mexica, which is like the kind of political unit that they were known as. But it's definitely not my area of expertise. I mean, I know enough about the Mexica to teach it, and I know enough about it to talk about them in my own work. I mean, really, my own expertise has to do with things like the history of the Inquisition, which was a Spanish court system established in Mexico. And also things like my first book that I published was about censorship in Mexico. And, and I did talk about some of the censorship efforts that targeted indigenous language material. So the Aztecs or the Mexica, they spoke Nahuatl, which is their main language. And there's still about 1 million Nahuatl speakers in Mexico, mostly concentrated in the states of Veracruz and Puebla, in the state of Mexico, also in Zacatecas a little bit, and in the state of Guerrero. And, the Nahuatl language is, I do not speak Nahuatl. I have a kind of a rudimentary vocabulary. And Nahuatl is a fascinating language because there's so many words in Spanish and Mexico that are Nahuatl in origin. I mean, tomate is a Nahuatl word. La chocolate, atole, petate. I mean, just the list goes on and on forever. And
I think also a lot of words that kind of have the X with the sh sound also those originate from Nahuatl, right? Yeah,
those are all. I mean, even the word Mexico or Mexica, those are all, the X didn't really exist in Spanish before the Spaniards got to Mexico, and then the X was kind of introduced because it makes a sound that doesn't really exist in Spanish. Well, it does now, but it didn't exist in Spanish before 1500s. But I mean, I don't really. I mean, the Mayans to me are too complicated to understand very well. I mean, I have a very basic understanding of the Mayans. The Mexicas I understand a little better because my own research has really focused on sort of central and central western Mexico. So like central Mexico and Michoacan. One of my most recent book was about Michoacan, and which were the principal ethnic group, or the Purépecha. And
is that so the kind of promiscuous power? I think it's
promiscuous
called, right?
Power. Yeah, it's about Michoacan, which is a state today, but the old province of Michoacan also encompassed parts, the state of Colima, parts of the state of Jalisco, parts of the state of Guanajuato, and parts of maybe the state of Guerrero, down in the Tierra Caliente. So it was a large province, but that was, my most recent book. So I kind of have focused really kind of on central Mexico, even though, I teach Mexican history, so I talk about all the different states. But I just happen to know more about the Mexica. In fact, I just checked out a whole bunch of books about the Mexica from the library yesterday because I'm working on a book that I've been working on for far too long. It's about acculturation in Mexico in the colonial period. So like basically the first century after contact. So from about 1520 to about the 1620s. But I'm a lot of the focus is on hallucinogen use. And
That's interesting that you say that, because I've actually heard or I've been listening to a lot of things that podcasts and so on, where not specifically in Mexico, but more so I believe it was in Greece, how there's paintings and suggestions that a lot of times they spiked their wine with some sort of hallucinogenic drugs to then entice visions and so on. So I mean, that's interesting. I didn't know it was in Mexico too.
Yeah, so I mean, some of the best known hallucinogens in the world are from Mexico. So shrooms, hallucinogenic mushrooms, are from Mexico originally. They're psilocybin mushrooms. They're native to Mexico. That's where they're from originally. They in Nahuatl they're called teonanak, which means food of the gods, actually. And because teo means God, or so teo, and then nanak. Nanak is like a mushroom, but it also refers to food. So teonanak are food of the gods. Those are shrooms, what we call shrooms. I don't know, do people still use that word, shrooms?
I think so, yeah.
Anyway, we used to call them shrooms today. But hallucinogenic mushrooms and peyote, which is a cactus, hallucinogenic cactus, the active ingredient is mescaline. And so those plants are from Mexico originally, and people have been using them in Mexico for a long time. We don't really know exactly because we don't have any written evidence from before the 1500s, but the archaeological evidence, they've found remains of peyote. So people have been using those hallucinogens for probably a couple thousand years at least in Mexico. And so I've done a lot of my research is kind of done. I'm just in the writing phase. But what I'm kind of interested in is what happens to these things after Spanish people get to Mexico, like, because the way that people use these things start to change, because in the pre-contact period, there were rules about how you were supposed to use this. It wasn't just like, ooh, we're tripping out, we're going to go to like an EDM show. And I mean, it wasn't like a party. It wasn't a party drug. It was
for rituals and spiritual
they had
occasions.
highly specific ritualized rules about how you're supposed to use it. So like peyote was used by the Wixárika people, who sometimes are also called the Huichols. And for them, it was a community ritual. They went on these pilgrimages. So the Huichols or the Wixárikas are from mostly the state of Nayarit, way out west. And they would go on these pilgrimages all the way to the desert up in San Luis Potosí, outside of Real de Catorce, and hunt the peyote. So like for the Wixárika people, deer and peyote are the same thing. And they would go on these pilgrimages once a year. It's a long way. It would take them a long time to walk. And then they would go looking for peyote. And peyote, you can store it for a long time, for months, and it'll stay active even after you dig it up. But they would take peyote all together, like the whole community would take peyote. And it wasn't like to trip out. It was to sort of have this divine, kind of communion with the divine, to kind of be one with the universe, the spirit. And shrooms that were used originally probably as some kind of a shamanistic thing. They would sometimes, priests, Aztec or Mexica priests, would take shrooms to figure out what was going to happen in the future, especially concerning wars. So like the emperor, which is known as a Tlatoani, so Moctezuma was a Tlatoani or an emperor, but we have like one of the emperors before him, Tizoc. He gathered his priests up and said, okay, guys, you guys are going to all take shrooms, and then you're going to tell me who's going to win this battle, because I'm thinking of invade. I can't remember who was going to invade. The Mexica were super aggressive and very militaristic and imperialistic. And he wanted, I can't remember right off the top of my head who they were going to invade some place. And he was like, okay, I want you to take shrooms and tell me whether or not we're going to win this battle, because if we're not going to win it, we're not going to have it. So they had all these rules about it. But once Europeans got there and there was, a Catholic kind of concept was kind of fused with this. And in fact, there's evidence that people started associating peyote with the Virgin of Guadalupe in the 1600s. So it's very complicated.
Yeah, I heard this theory. I'm not sure if it necessarily applies to Mexico or more so um Europe and so on. I'm guessing it should be applicable to most places, but it made sense in my head, and that's that when the church started to get involved with these psychedelic substances and what people used to take in before, um I guess one of the reasons they think that maybe they started, because if I'm not mistaken, they started limiting these substances, right? They didn't want the people having access to them as they did before, I think.
It's complicated. I mean, in the case of
Okay.
Mexico, what happened was, and this is one of the reasons why we know about it, is because peyote use was made illegal in 1620 by the Inquisition. Said, okay, peyote use is now illegal. But the kind of interesting thing that, and I'm still trying to figure this out, nobody seems to have the answer. So the Inquisition had been around in one form or another in Mexico since the 1520s. And then all of a sudden in 1620, they said, okay, nobody can use peyote anymore, it's illegal. And then there's all these people who get in trouble for it right afterwards because but nobody gets prosecuted. Like the Inquisition doesn't seem to care. It's like they have their own rule. It says you can't use it. And then whenever people get denounced for it, the Inquisition's like, oh, whatever, we don't really care. So it's a little bit confusing.
Yeah.
The
Because
main, go ahead, sorry.
no, finish, and then I'll finish after
Oh,
you.
well, the logic that the church had about the Catholic Church, the reason that they said you shouldn't take peyote is that it would strip you of your ability to have reason, that you would lose your reason. And because if you lose your reason, the devil is very sneaky. So if you lose your reason, you're more susceptible to being tricked by the devil. So that was the main thing that they kind of associated with the devil.
Yeah. The going back to the theory I heard, or what some people believe, is that when people used to have these when they took these substances and they had these experiences and these spiritual awakenings and so on, some people claim to experience kind of being in the presence of a greater power, or sometimes like associating it to God and so on. And so what some people believe is that the church wanted to limit these the access to these substances, because then that way the people taking these psychedelics could directly have contact with God without having to go through the church.
Yeah. I mean, it's possible. It doesn't. I've never really seen any specific evidence for that. I mean, I think the European case is a little iffy. There aren't any hallucinogenic plants that are from Europe that anybody has ever heard of. All the hallucinogenic plants that are out there in the world are from South America or Mexico, or there's some of them from Russia. Blanking out the name of the red death cap mushrooms. Anyway, the word will come to me. But Europe didn't have hallucinogenic plants. Like they didn't have hallucinogenic mushrooms. There was no peyote. The other really powerful hallucinogen that people have been using is ayahuasca, which has become kind of well known these days, which is from the Amazon mostly. It's actually two different plants that you have to put together, otherwise it doesn't really work. So actually, it's funny that we're talking about this because I was just writing about this. Let's see if I'll get you the name. So it's a vine called Banisteriopsis caapi, and then there's a bush called Psychotria viridis, and those are two different plants. And I guess I've never taken it, but if you eat either the Banisteriopsis caapi vine or the Psychotria or Psychotria viridis bush, by themselves, I guess they don't really do much, but together it's like crazy. It's like a super powerful hallucinogen, and nobody really outside of the Amazon really knew about these until like about the 1930s.
Yeah, I think going back to that what I said about the Greeks spiking
Uh-huh.
their wine with some sort of hallucinogen. I
Yeah,
think it was with ergot, which is a fungus that
right,
grows, I believe.
right, right. There's a fungus that grows on ergot, and it's actually that's what LSD was derived from.
Yeah.
Was from this fungus that grows on ergot. And so there's a bunch of different theories about people accidentally tripping out that ergot would grow on grain. So like you'd have like a bunch of rye, and the ergot would, it's like a fungus and would grow, and people would accidentally eat it, trip out. So it may be that nobody. I mean, as far as I know, nobody's really been able to prove it. There's just like a lot of theories about this, and maybe these people, were eating ergot. But we do know that LSD was synthesized using ergot.
Yeah, I didn't know those plants weren't like they weren't present, or they aren't in
Yeah, they didn't. There
originally
were
from
no
Europe.
like there were no hallucinogenic mushrooms in Europe before the 1950s, because they didn't know about it. There was this guy Gordon Wasson, who was a banker from New York, and he and his wife, who was a pediatrician, they were really interested in mushrooms and also interested in hallucinogens. And they went to Mexico in the 1950s, mid 1950s, and sought out this woman named Maria Sabina, who's now kind of famous. There's images of her smoking a joint, and you've probably seen them if you've ever been to like a market in Coyoacan or something. They sell little pictures of her, and he went and looked for her. She was a famous folk healer, curandera. She was Mazatec from the very northern part of I forget, it's part of Puebla, Guerrero. Anyway, she was well known as a curandera, and that she took mushrooms to kind of, and the way that she used mushrooms were she would take the shrooms, and the shrooms would provide her some kind of cosmological knowledge that would allow her to determine the cause of someone's sickness. So this was like a device to cure people of their ailments. The idea was that the mushroom spirit would come to you and would tell her, because she had this special ability to commune with the spirits, would tell her what the problem was, and that she could cure people by eliminating the cosmological source of their disease. That was at least the idea. And so this guy Gordon Wasson and his wife and a couple other people went down there, and they found her, and they took shrooms with her, and they were then on the cover of Life magazine this was in 1957. They were on the cover of Life magazine, and it was like this was, nobody really knew about it. This was kind of before the hippie movement, and so then people started going to look for mushrooms in Mexico, and they brought mushrooms back, and they grew them from spores in a lab in France. And that was kind of the beginning of people outside of Mexico knowing about shrooms, really, because the Spanish people in Mexico knew about them before this. And same with peyote. Peyote, people knew about it. It was, they're obviously very strong drugs. And so it's not just for the average person.
Yeah.
To just be like, okay, let's go do this. It's like a very small subset of society that's going to use those things, because they had other ways of getting high or getting drunk, which was to drink wine or drink pulque or whatever.
Yeah. So what your book right now that you're writing is about is mainly on how the Spanish were involved with this whole with these hallucinogens as soon as they got to Mexico. Is that what it revolves around?
It's about I mean, kind of in the broader sense, the book is about sort of today people call it cultural appropriation, but I call it sort of it's about how certain types of indigenous cultural things were then adopted by people who weren't indigenous, so Spanish people or people of mixed ethnicity, and sort of what they did when they started doing things like taking peyote or eating shrooms, and also other things. There's other forms of cultural appropriation that I talk about in this book. It just so happens that a significant portion of the book is about hallucinogens, in particular peyote and shrooms. And, so it's interesting kind of because, before contact, the evidence that we have is really archaeological. And then there's these people who wrote, like missionaries wrote accounts of the pre-Hispanic people. And some of those accounts talk about some of these things, talk about some of these hallucinogens. But then once it became something that could get you in trouble, people got in trouble, and then there would be a trial transcript. So I've read the trial transcripts of these people who get in trouble for doing things they're not supposed to, and they get accused of things like sorcery or witchcraft. And then I read those trial transcripts to kind of see what's going on. So it changes because people were taking peyote as a sort of community activity, all together, like we all take it together, and it was ritualized and it was sacred. And the Spanish and other people, mixed ethnicity peoples, when they took things like peyote, it ceased to be a community event. They started doing it on their own or with like one other person. So it wasn't for them, it wasn't a community event. And it was also in many cases stripped of its religious significance. These are people like, I'm going to take peyote because the peyote will tell me where the horse is that somebody stole from me. That was actually a common thing, that people thought that if you ate peyote, you could find things that had been stolen or lost. My girlfriend left me, where'd she go? I'll take peyote, the peyote will tell me. I lost a silver spoon. My master's after me, I'll take peyote, I'll find the silver spoon. So it's also, people used it for medicinal purposes. That people sometimes used it for gout and arthritis. So they would take the peyote and grind it up and put it in some kind of oil, maybe lard or something, and make a kind of an ungüento, like an ointment out of it. And they rub it on their joints as a kind of a way to relieve the symptoms of arthritis. That seemed to be a thing. Sometimes people did it to find out the intentions of someone they were in love with, in love with somebody. Does he love me or not? I'll take peyote. The peyote will tell me. So it became it took on a kind of a practical kind of aspect. The other thing is that people started referring to peyote by the various names of saints. So like Niño de Atocha or Santo Niño de Jesus or Santa Rosa, or the Virgin of Guadalupe. So people started calling peyote saints. So there was a clear association with peyote and holiness and sacredness, but it got transferred into a Catholic context. And
Yeah.
they also seem to have kept this basic idea, which is probably Quixotica in origin, which is that you're supposed to abstain from certain things in advance of taking peyote. So you're supposed to not eat for like a day before you eat the peyote, which kind of makes sense because peyote tends to make people puke. So you were supposed to not eat, you were supposed to fast for like 24 hours. And then there were like prohibitions, like you weren't supposed to have sex with anyone for like a week in advance of taking peyote, which is something that the Mexica did with some certain particular religious rituals. You were supposed to abstain from sex before the religious ceremony took place. So there's kind of these elements of indigenous culture that get transferred into post-contact peyote use, that people, even though the people who are taking it are Catholic, but they're observing certain kinds of pre-Hispanic cultural norms.
Was it limited to certain people, like, or I don't know, maybe people of mostly the upper class within the Mexica, or was it just anyone could take it?
Well, so peyote wasn't really, as far as we know, the Mexica probably didn't take peyote. It was considered, well, they called it a chichimec custom. So the chichimec is a Nahuatl word for just anybody, for basically like the Mexicas. There were, in other words, like people in the northern part of Mexico, central and the north, were sort of semi-nomadic people, and the Mexicas thought they were barbarians. And their word for barbarian was Chichimec. But the Chichimecs are really a bunch of different groups, like the Huachichil and Pames and the Otomis and all these different other ethnic groups that are from the, you know, states like Zacatecas and San Luis Potosí and Coahuila and Guanajuato and Querétaro, kind of center north Mexico. So the Mexica, as far as we know, probably doesn't seem to be any evidence that the Mexica, the people in central Mexico, took peyote. It seemed to have been something that was associated with these so-called Chichimec peoples, that is to say, people from the further north than central Mexico. But we don't really know, to be honest. But the shrooms, on the other hand, seem to have were for sure used by the Mexica. So it's a little bit unclear the extent. Like some of the archaeological evidence for peyote is as far north as the Rio Grande Valley, you know, up in Texas. So it seems that peyote, and the other, you know, peyote doesn't grow in central Mexico. It grows in sort of the high desert up in the Altiplano in places like San Luis Potosí. And that's like its kind of its natural habitat is that area. It's kind of further north in, you know, San Luis Potosí, Coahuila, and those parts of Mexico. Doesn't grow in central Mexico. So it doesn't seem that the Aztecs or the Mexica took peyote, though we'll probably never really know. There doesn't seem to be any evidence. The shroom, but in the case of peyote, it wasn't really class stratified because everybody in that society took it. The shrooms were something that, in the case of the Mexica, at least what we know, seems that shrooms were things that were really mostly just priests took. In the Aztec or Mexica religion, it was probably just priests. I don't think, but again, we don't really know that much. We only know what happens after contact for sure, because that's when we have actual written records of people taking shrooms and taking peyote.
Yeah, it's interesting with all these cultures how, like, the implications that these substances have, not only from like taking it and then being able to tell whether, you know, your lover is gonna love you forever or not, but more so like in the development of the cultures as a whole and how that impacted, for example, their beliefs in their different gods and their different deities. And because it makes sense, or at least I think so. I think it makes sense that when, you know, they take these when they consume these plants and they have these visions, they then tend to believe in certain things that maybe before they didn't. And so they gravitate towards these maybe new ideologies, and they try to implement those and I guess show those to the other people within the community. And I think that's interesting because it could, at the end of the day, like you said, we don't know before there was contact, but it might have there might be, before there was contact, it might have played a big role in kind of like creating these communities, I think, and the way they lived and the things they believed in.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely interesting with the effects that these plants have on the cultures and the different beliefs and so on. And you said there was different other types of cultural appropriation when the Spanish got there. Like, which other ones are you talking about in your book?
I mean, well, language is one of them. There's a lot of cases of Spanish people who learn indigenous languages. Usually Nahuatl was the one that most of them learned because it became kind of a generally accepted language after contact. So people, and also, you know, so there's a lot of Nahuatl words that start showing up in Spanish in the 16th century. So like tianguis, which I'm sure you've heard before, is a kind of a farmer's market. a word still in very common use today in Mexico. And tianguis is a Nahuatl word that means basically like what we would call a farmer's market, but for them it was a market. The principal tianguis of the Valley of Mexico was in Tlatelolco, and it was huge. I mean, people say that maybe 100,000 people went there a day in pre-contact Tenochtitlan. So that was the main tianguis. So tianguis, that word shows up in Spanish very early, probably about the 1520s. So less than 10 years after contact. And a lot of other words start showing up. So there's Nahuatl words. There's also food appropriation is probably the most immediate one. And certain foods were adopted really quickly, like cacao, which was used to make chocolate. Chocolate became immediately popular among Spaniards, and then was eventually exported to Spain and the rest of Europe. So, but then other foods like tomatoes, at first the Spaniards were suspicious of tomatoes because they are nightshades, so they thought they were poisonous. But the tomatoes were incorporated into Spanish eating habits, after about a century. So, but chili peppers, which are original to Mexico, were also incorporated into the Spanish diet. It's hard to know in terms of like tortillas and masa, corn-based products, because a lot of Spaniards insisted on eating bread as a kind of a marker of cultural status as being Spanish. But the reality is that wasn't really that much Spanish bread in the 16th century. By the time you get to like the 18th century, then you have lots of bakeries. But in the early period, if you don't eat tortillas, you just don't have any bread. So there's a lot of food adoption. Also pulque, which I don't know if you ever had pulque before.
I've never tried it, no.
So pulque is a fermented drink that comes from the agua miel, from the maguey cactus. So like it's the same plant that they use to make tequila, except that the process is a lot different. And the maguey or the agave cactus, in the inside, there's this kind of milky white liquid called agua miel. And if you extract it and ferment it, it becomes pulque, which is it's a fermented drink. It has alcohol, but not very much. It's like 1% to 2% alcohol. So it's very relatively weak. And it was used it was widely used all over Mexico in the pre-contact period as a kind of a ritual thing. People drank it on certain festivals. And on other festivals, it was explicitly forbidden. So it wasn't like a thing that you were just like, oh, it's the end of the day, I'm going to kick back with with pulque. It wasn't like that. It wasn't just like something that you drank to relax with. It had a ritual purpose. It was associated with certain festivals. And people also used it to cook. There's like rabbit in like conejo en salsa borracha, which is rabbit in drunk sauce, which is made from pulque, and I think I just forget, is it chile pasilla or guajillo, but it's one of those, I think it's pasilla, is a traditional pre-Hispanic dish. You can actually have that in the restaurant Cardena in Mexico City. Conejo en salsa borracha, it's pulque and chile pasilla. There's probably some other ingredients, but once the Spanish got to Mexico, people started the ritual, the control of the consumption of pulque started to get stripped away. So people started drinking pulque just to get drunk, or as a way of getting buzz. It seemed to be largely restricted to indigenous communities and maybe people of mixed ethnicity. But there were some Spaniards who drank it, but it doesn't seem to have been very popular among Spaniards, because I think they associated it as a marker of being indigenous.
Yeah. Did the Spaniards bring any sort of alcohol with them? Did they rum maybe from other Caribbean islands?
Rum, not in the early period, later, but mostly first wine, Spanish wine.
Okay.
Partly because the Spanish economic system prohibited the manufacture of wine in the Americas. So it was illegal to manufacture grape wine. There were some early forms of grape wine industry, but it was generally prohibited. So they imported Spanish wine, and then Spanish brandy, aguardiente, eventually got imported as well. So those were kind of the main forms of alcohol that were imported from Spain. Beer, no, as far as we know, not until later, probably not until the 19th century. But yeah, wine and brandy were being imported from or exported from Spain into Mexico, and that was what Spanish people drank.
Yeah. Also, I'm not sure as to when exactly, so the Spanish get to, what was it? I believe some sort of port in Veracruz, I imagine.
That
right?
was the
That's
main port. That was the main port that was approved for the transatlantic trade. So everything came in and out of. There was a port in Campeche also.
Okay.
But the main port was in and out of Veracruz. So the products that came from Spain, they would leave Spain and they'd go across the ocean and maybe make a provisioning stop like in Puerto Rico, and then they would go from there to Veracruz and unload the boats in Veracruz. And then
so once Cortez gets to Mexico and they settle down and so on, how often do the Spanish go back and forth from Spain?
Some people never go back.
Okay.
And some people go back once or twice. Most people don't go back a lot. It's dangerous. The conditions are not necessarily that sanitary. That's a high mortality rate. The mortality rates are as high as 10% on those transatlantic voyages. They're higher for people who are enslaved and they're making the middle passage. But even the non-enslaved people on those voyages, it was dangerous because the conditions were crowded and dirty, and so disease can spread very quickly. So they were, people didn't go back and forth a lot unless they really needed to. Some people did go back and forth sometimes because they were, they like somebody would be appointed a judge or something, and they would leave Spain and go to Peru or Panama or Mexico or something. They'd be a judge, and then maybe they'd get, maybe they'd go back to Spain, or maybe they'd go from Mexico to Peru. And so there were people that traveled around, but your average people didn't. If you were an immigrant from Spain, you went to Mexico, pretty good chance you never went back. It was just expensive. It's a long journey. It's hot. It's crowded. It's dirty. It's not sanitary. People died, on board those ships of disease all the time.
What made a Spaniard from Spain what would make them want to go to Mexico? I feel like it would be, like you said, it's a big risk because you can, in the journey you can get sick and die, but you don't know what's like in the other side. What would motivate them to go?
Yeah. It's the main reason people migrate in general is perception of better opportunities. Okay. The idea that there were better job opportunities or better economic opportunities for you. So in the early period, it was all about conquest and exploration. And then later, it's just more kind of general perception that there's a better job, better economic possibilities for you. If you were from Spain, there's this kind of racial hierarchy so that you were, considered racially superior or whatever that's supposed to mean. The percentage of people living in Mexico before, say, the 19th century who were Spanish is pretty low. It's not like, most of the population is indigenous or African.
Yeah. What now? I'm not too sure. A lot of times in school we learn about in basic levels of history. I'm sure later on you learn more, but you don't tend to learn so much about slavery in Mexico as opposed to the people that get enslaved, from the Caribbean islands or from in the United States or in Africa. But in Mexico, how was slavery and that system? What role did it play? How was it implemented? Because I don't really know too much about that.
There were slaves imported into Mexico, it's not the same level in terms of numbers as it is for a place like Brazil. Brazil is the place that has the most amount of slaves of any country in the Americas that were forcibly sent to it. After Brazil, it's the places that had the most amount of slaves were Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba. Those were the places that got large, but Mexico did have a fair amount of slaves. I don't have my notes in front of me about that, but Mexico did have slaves. The main reason that Mexico didn't have like gigantic amounts of slaves that you had in, say, Haiti or Jamaica or Cuba or Brazil is that there was a pre-existing very large indigenous population, and that formed the basic labor source for Mexico was indigenous people that we don't really know how many people were in central Mexico at the time of contact. Some people say it's as much as 25 million. We do know that they probably somewhere around 90% of the indigenous peoples in Mexico died within 100 years mostly through disease, epidemic disease. But still, there's like, in 1620, which is the low point of the indigenous population in Mexico, there's still probably at least 1 million people, which at that time period is a lot of people. So there weren't the same labor demands, there was a large labor force in Mexico. So the other thing is that African slavery in the Americas, in terms of the big numbers, the big numbers of people went to sugar plantations. So that's why the numbers are so big in places like Haiti, Jamaica, Cuba, and Brazil, because they were sugar plantation slaves. And Mexico did have sugar plantations, and they did have slaves on the sugar plantations. So places like state of Morelos, but Mexico didn't have a big sugar plantation economy. So there's a combination of different kinds of slavery in Mexico. There were a lot of the slavery in Mexico was domestic slavery. And domestic slavery was often a status symbol for people of wealth or of high standing, that having slaves was a way of showing people that you had money. And so people would have domestic slaves to do things like drive them around in carriages, or attend to them at home, or cook. People also who owned slaves would hire their slaves out to do work for other people and then keep the profit. So there was a lot of urban slavery in Mexico, in places like Mexico City and Puebla. So there's domestic slavery, and then there's also slaves that were sent to mines. But there's obviously a lot of African slaves sent to Mexico, and the numbers are constantly changing. I may be able to find the numbers here. Give me just a second here, and I might be able to find the numbers on the amount of slaves that went to.
Were they like slaves, or did they just get paid like extremely small amounts?
There definitely were people who were slaves. I mean, they were bought,
okay,
against their will, obviously, in Africa, and then were imported to Mexico against their will. So they, obviously, they're slaves. Just trying to see if I can find the actual numbers, but it may take me too long to find the numbers. But it's a couple hundred.
No worries.
It's nothing like the numbers you see in the Caribbean or in Brazil. But they were slaves. They had no rights. Although, slavery in Latin America is in some ways different than it was in the United States. Partly because of the Catholic Church, because you could become Catholic, you could be a slave and become Catholic, and if you did, the church, you couldn't break families up, slave families in Mexico. You couldn't break them up; had to allow them to remain together, and that was not the case in the United States. The families were broken up all the time in the United States.
Yeah.
In Mexico and the rest of Latin America, that was not the case, because it was considered a violation of the sacrament of marriage. And so the other thing that was could happen and did happen. I mean, I'm not trying to make it sound like, oh, it was so great, because it was obviously horrible to be a slave, but you could buy your way out of slavery. And other people would sometimes manumit they would free their slaves as a kind of act of good works to try to get them out of purgatory faster when they died. But, obviously slavery is horrible. I think we can all sort of agree.
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm trying to find the numbers for Mexico, but Mexico, where's Mexico? Looking for my notes, but can't find it. Anyway, the numbers in Mexico are a lot smaller.
Yeah.
Like, for example, the total numbers are about close to 4 million slaves were sent to Brazil. Saint Domingue, which became Haiti, is like 800,000. Jamaica is 1.1 million. United States, 360,000. And Spanish Caribbean, about 800,000. And the largest amount of slaves that were sent to the Americas, especially in the Caribbean, occurred after 1750 and after 1700. So I think in Mexico, I'm not finding my notes, but the total amount of slaves that were sent to the Spanish mainland, that is to say, places like Colombia, Peru, Mexico, not the Caribbean, is 430,000 or so, which is a lot less than, I mean, that's like half of the amount of slaves that were sent to Haiti. So,
Wow.
And something close to 800,000 slaves were sent to the Spanish Caribbean. So that's today Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Puerto Rico.
Yeah. When did so once these I guess systems and these hierarchies are implemented, and there's and you have your different classes, at what point really does the whole concept of slavery start to diminish and like start to disappear in Mexico and in the Mexican cultures?
Well, slavery was abolished by decree during the independence period. So Miguel Hidalgo decreed the end of slavery. And again, I don't have my notes sitting in front of me. I think it's 1812. And it was written into the early constitution of the Patzingan that was drawn up during the independence movement. So slavery was officially abolished in Mexico during the 18 teens in the independence movement. And the actual, kind of the actual real end of slavery is later when Vicente Guerrero was president. Vicente Guerrero, who was, his grandparents had been African slaves, so he was actually he was an Afro-Mexican. He was half of his kind of ethnicity is Black or African. And when he was president, he was the person to actually end slavery in Mexico. So slavery really was ended in Mexico by 1830, even though it was decreed from a legal and constitutional standpoint in the 18 teens. In the 1820s, it wasn't really effectively ended until about 1830. So that's when slavery officially ended in Mexico, good 30 some years earlier than the United States.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that. It's
so and again, I don't have my notes sitting right in front of me. I probably should have, but yeah, that's kind of the end of slavery as a legal system in the 1820s.
And would you say that once it legally got, I guess, prohibited, once it got prohibited, slavery got prohibited, do you know, or are you aware of if the people actually started to follow these, I guess, social rules, these social cues, or were they still, was segregation still a big thing?
Well, I mean, Mexico is is much different than the United States example. I mean, partly because ethnic mixing is much more common in Mexico than it was in the United States. I mean, it was in the United States, except that just nobody likes to talk about it. But Mexico, ethnic mixing was very common and normal. So you didn't really have segregated communities in Mexico, not like they did in the United States. And that wasn't really a thing in Mexico. And again, Mexico didn't have a high reliance on slave labor. And so it was less of a defining issue in Mexico than it was in the United States. I mean, one of the main reasons that that Texas, split away from Mexico in the 1830s, and one of the main reasons that there was a war between Mexico and the United States over Texas was about slavery. It was that there were white settlers from the Carolinas and other parts of the United States South who went to Texas with the express purpose of turning Texas into a slave state as part of the United States. And a lot of these battles were fought because of Vicente Guerrero ending slavery. And the response was these people like Sam Austin and others. Is that Sam Austin or Sam Houston? I just forget. There's the Austin guy and the Houston guy. But there were white slave-holding settlers from the U.S. South who settled in Texas and wanted to turn it into a slave labor regime. And and what happened was that then under Mexican law, Texas was still part of Mexico, and under Mexican law, slavery was illegal. And so what was happening was that these people were essentially breaking the Mexican federal law, and then this resulted in conflict in Texas over that. I mean, it's a very complicated story, but basically, Santa Anna lost a bunch of battles, and the Mexican government basically just agreed to kind of leave Texas alone, that they agreed not to try to invade Texas anymore. And then eventually this became such a sticking point politically between the United States and Mexico that it led to the war in 1846 and the U.S. invasion of Mexico. But the main purpose was to take Texas away and turn it into a slave state. And
the motivation behind their attack to Mexico was to take that land specifically, like you said, for or to have the ability to then use it as farmland and to be able to use
for cotton,
for slavery.
But that was the original motivation for people, for white Anglo settlers moving into Texas. The original motivation was to establish it as a slave holding regime.
Okay, so in Mexico it was more so always and more so after after it got deemed illegal, but it was more so just like a hierarchy of classes in the way it worked.
Yeah, I mean, it's like most societies, it's very hierarchical. Right. It's just that the hierarchy in Mexico was, I mean, it was partly based on skin color and ethnicity, but also based on money and status. But skin color is clearly a part of the overall calculus and the way that people are determined to be of a certain class or a certain status based on their skin color. I mean, Mexico is no different than any other country in that sense, that it's, most societies have a baseline kind of form of racism. And right. It's just that in Mexico, the difference is that you don't really have this kind of like stark kind of segregated, space of like white space versus black space. That sort of segregation didn't exist. I mean, even in the colonial period, there was this idea that there was a República de Españoles and a República de Indios, a Republic of Spaniards and a Republic of Indians. It never really functioned in reality that way. There was never, even though in theory these were supposed to be segregated spaces, but it never actually worked. And it just didn't work that way. Whereas the United States had a much stricter form of racial separation. And the other big difference is that, the Anglo-English and settlers never they didn't really intermarry with the indigenous peoples the way Spaniards did in Mexico. Intermarriage and mixed ethnic children were very common in Mexico from the very beginning. And that was not the case in what became the United States.
Yeah, and that definitely, I think, made sense. That makes sense that played a big factor into why the United States system was so different from what you're telling me to what the Mexican system was, and like how society functioned and their and the ideologies they held. Because if when, of course, with the two cultures mix, and you have a lot of I think they were called mestizos and criollos, right, in Mexico.
Mestizos are people of mixed in indigenous and Spanish background.
Okay.
Criollos are people who are ethnically Spanish but born in the Americas.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so with the mestizos, right? So when people from two different cultures had, bore a child and it was mixed, then I think then it wouldn't make sense for them to want to create these, I guess, exaggerate these hierarchical classes even more, as they did, for example, in the United States, where they didn't mix, or where a lot of times they did, but they just hide it. They hid it because they didn't want to show it to.
Yeah, it's very
others.
complicated, but from the if you consider the issue of slavery in the case of Mexico versus the United States, starting in the 1820s, in the 1820s, 1830s, there were a lot of people who fled to slavery in the United States to go to Mexico. Black people that ran away from slavery to try to go to Mexico in the 1820s, 1830s. This was actually a thing. There's a guy at the University of Tennessee who works on this. Kind of Bo Gators is his name. He works on this kind of the fluidity between these borders, and people would try to escape slavery in the United States and go to Mexico because it wasn't, because slavery had been outlawed.
Yeah.
In this kind of interim period. So it's complicated. I just have to warn you here. I'm gonna have to go in probably about 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we can. We've been talking for a while. It's been over an hour, so if we want, we can wrap it up.
But I don't know if you have any kind of final questions or something, or.
Well, I there's so much to cover.
Yeah, there's so much. You'd have to take my class. It's like a whole semester of nothing but Mexico, and that's only, and we only the class. I'm teaching that in the fall, and that class only starts in 1810. So I don't even talk about the colonial period in that class, the one I'm teaching in the fall, because I teach a different class that's kind of like the colonial period in Latin America, just kind of in general. So it's part Mexico, part Caribbean, part Brazil, part Andes. But this class that I'm teaching is just all Mexico the whole semester, and even then it's barely scratching the surface. The way I teach that class, it's modern Mexico, so we start with the independence movement and we go up to about the 1990s or so. And the way I teach that class is I do kind of a basic kind of cultural, political, social history narrative of Mexico, but I also every class period I do kind of cultural geography, and I talk about a particular state of Mexico, and talk a little bit about that state, something about its customs or its food or its music or its geography or famous people from that state, or famous things that happened there, because I think usually people who take my class on Mexican history don't really know anything about Mexico. They just think everything looks like Cancun.
Yeah.
Yeah, they just have no clue.
Or the people are just on donkeys with their
right. They just have no
sombreros
clue.
with cactus all around.
And they think that burritos are Mexican, and it's just they just don't. And I have to explain to them on the first day that burritos are American food, and they're like, wait, what? What are you talking about? It's like, no, dude, Mexican people. There's no burritos in Mexico. That's not Mexican food. You have to get that out of your head, And and so it comes as like a shock to them that there's like this incredible regional diversity in Mexico, because every state is,
So
the diversity
different.
in Mexico
Yeah.
is so mind-boggling, and it's just incredible, the diversity of food, of customs, of dress, of geography, of culture, music, everything. It's just so, Mexico like has one of the countries with the highest level of biodiversity in the world. I think it's like the 5th highest or something, like in terms of biodiversity. It's an incredibly biodiverse place.
Yeah.
And people, I think pretty much everybody who doesn't know anything, most people just don't know that. They just think that, it's either all desert or, I even had like people who are theoretically very highly educated ask me, like, isn't it really hot in Mexico City in the summer? And I'm like, no. Why do you think that? They just think that, because it's further south, it must be hot. It's like, well, do you know anything about altitude? It's like Mexico City is like more than 7,000 feet above sea level. It's like that kind of has an effect on the climate, and people just think like, oh, it's further south, so it must be hot. It's like, no, dude, go to Zacatecas sometime.
Yeah.
Zacatecas is cold in the winter.
Yeah. It really is. There's a huge, like I said, the huge diversity in, like you said, in climate, the way people dress, the way people talk,
everything,
the way people look.
Food,
yeah,
you name it. Everything. Yeah. So,
but thank you. Like you said, I'd like to definitely like to learn more. It's hard to, like, also, as you said, with your class, you don't get too much in depth. I think it's hard to do that at an undergraduate level anyway. When you really want to learn about,
do a little bit. Yeah, you got to go to graduate school.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a big commitment on a single thing that you want to do for graduate school.
Yeah, that it is. That is no doubt.
I don't know if you want to, say something about maybe the books you've published, like where people can find them, or when maybe you think the new one's gonna come out.
They're all on Amazon.
Okay.
You can buy them on Amazon. We got most of them in the library at the University of Miami, and so they're all, purchasable on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, or through the individual presses, like University of Texas Press or Yale University Press, or University of New Mexico Press, or whichever press, Penn State University Press. They're out there. The book I'm writing right now, I don't know. I got to finish writing it first. It's about, that's what I'm actually working on, like right now as we speak. Like when I get off this call, I'm going to be working on that. So right now, I don't know, maybe in a couple of years, if I'm lucky, if I really, get my shit together and finish writing it this summer. I'm hoping that by the time classes start, that I'll have like kind of a sort of a working draft of the book, and then it has to be, then I have to revise it, and then I have to send it out, and it has to be evaluated, and people have to tell me how stupid I am before I can publish it, and then eventually, to get published. But I don't know, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years. Academic books take a long time to publish. There's like it's a very long process. It's not like writing a novel.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it's in process. I've published a little bit from this project about hallucinogens. I just had a article come out in an encyclopedia it's called the Oxford Companion. What's it called? The Oxford Handbook of Global Drug History.
Yeah, it sounds like an interesting like concept, and I mean, once it comes out, I'd like to give it a look.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
it'll be out eventually.
Yeah, but thank you. I do appreciate your time and everything.
My pleasure.
And if you ever want to come back, and we can, there's a lot more to talk about. I'm sure we could figure some more to talk about.
Yeah, definitely.
No, thank you.